What if I told you the night a pastor knocked on my door was the night my life quietly ended, not with noise or chaos, but with smiles, prayers, and words that sounded holy enough to hide something deeply wrong? Because my name is Celestine Brooks, and I've lived more than 8 decades carrying a story that never truly left me. A story that began in a small town where faith was everything and questioning it felt like a sin you couldn't wash away. And back then I was just a girl, 15 years old, raised to believe that anything spoken in God's name had to be good, had to be right, had to be trusted. And maybe you know that feeling too. When you're taught not just to listen, but to obey without hesitation, because in Bamberg, South Carolina, the church wasn't just a building, it was the center of life, the place where every decision felt guided, every fear felt answered. And every person believed they were part of something bigger than themselves. And I believed that too. I really did, because my parents believed it, my neighbors believed it. Everyone around me believed it so deeply that it felt impossible to imagine anything else. And that's what made what happened next so powerful, because when everyone believes something is right, you don't even consider that it could be wrong. And that's how it begins, quietly, without warning, without resistance, just a slow shift that you don't notice until it's already changed everything. And I remember that night so clearly. The air was thick and heavy. The kind that sticks to your skin, the kind that makes everything feel slower, heavier, almost like the world itself is holding its breath. And outside, a storm was rolling in, wind pressing against the windows, thunder cracking through the sky. The kind of night that makes you stay close to home, the kind of night where nothing unexpected is supposed to happen. And yet something did, because right in the middle of that storm, there was a knock on our door, not a hesitant knock. Not a soft one, but firm, deliberate, like whoever stood outside knew exactly why they were there. And I remember the way my father stood up immediately, the way my mother looked toward the door with anticipation instead of fear. Because in our home, a late night visitor didn't mean danger, it meant importance. And when that door opened, everything shifted, because standing there in the rain, framed by lightning and shadow, was Pastor Jeremiah Caldwell. The man everyone trusted, the man whose voice filled the church every Sunday, the man people believed spoke directly with God. And maybe that's the part you need to understand. He wasn't just respected, he was unquestioned. The kind of man whose words didn't get challenged, they got followed. And as he stepped inside, bringing the cold air and the scent of rain with him, the entire room seemed to change, like his presence alone demanded attention, demanded belief. And I tried to make myself smaller in that moment, sitting quietly, hoping not to be noticed. But his eyes, they found me almost immediately, and there was something about the way he looked at me that made my stomach tighten. Something I couldn't explain, something I didn't yet understand, but something inside me knew wasn't right, even if I didn't have the words for it yet. And that's the strange thing about moments like that. Your body understands before your mind does, your instincts react before your thoughts can catch up. And while I sat there trying to ignore that feeling, he began to speak, not to me at first, but to my parents, his voice calm, steady, powerful enough to fill the room without ever needing to rise. And he told them he had been praying, that he had received a vision, that God had shown him something important, something special. And as he spoke, I watched my parents' faces change, watched their expressions shift from curiosity to awe, because when someone you trust completely says they've heard from God, you don't question it, you believe it, and they believed every word. Every single one. And then he said my name, and everything inside me seemed to freeze, because suddenly this wasn't just a message, it was about me. And he told them that I had been chosen, that I had a purpose beyond anything we could understand, that I was meant for something sacred, something divine. And maybe from the outside that sounds like an honor, maybe it sounds like something beautiful. But standing there in that moment, hearing those words, I didn't feel special. I felt afraid, and I didn't know why. I couldn't explain it. I couldn't even say it out loud, because how do you tell your own parents that something holy feels wrong? How do you question something everyone else sees as a blessing? And that's where the trap begins, because silence becomes easier than doubt, and doubt feels more dangerous than obedience. And as I looked at my parents, I saw tears in my mother's eyes, not tears of fear, but tears of pride, and my father stood there nodding slowly, like he was witnessing something sacred unfold right in front of him. And in that moment, I realized something I wasn't ready to admit yet. I wasn't being asked what I wanted. I wasn't being given a choice. I was being given away in a way that no one in that room recognized as loss. And then the pastor stepped closer, reaching out, taking my hand in his grip warm but unsettling, and he said the words that would stay with me for the rest of my life. Words that sounded righteous to everyone else, but felt like a quiet sentence being passed over me. He said that I was to become his spiritual wife, and those words hung in the air, heavy, confusing. Impossible to fully understand at 15, but powerful enough to change everything instantly, because from that moment on, I wasn't just a daughter anymore. I wasn't just a girl in a small town, I had been turned into something else entirely. Something I didn't choose, something I didn't understand, and as the storm raged outside, louder than ever, I remember looking around that room, searching for even one face that looked unsure, one person who might question what was happening, but there was nothing but belief, nothing but acceptance, nothing but smiles and tears and quiet gratitude. And that was the moment it truly began, not with force, not with resistance, but with agreement, with trust, with faith placed in the wrong place at the wrong time. And as I stood there, my hand still in his, my parents standing proudly beside me, I felt something deep inside me shift, something I couldn't undo, something I couldn't escape, because everyone else saw it as the beginning of something sacred, but I knew even then, even without understanding why, that it was the end of the life I had known. And if you think that was the worst part, it wasn't, because what came next didn't happen all at once. It happened slowly, quietly, in ways that made it even harder to see. And the scariest part of all was how normal it started to feel. They called it a blessing, but have you ever noticed how the things that trap you the deepest don't feel like cages at first? They feel like something you're supposed to be grateful for. Something you're told is good so many times that you start questioning your own fear instead of the situation itself. And that's exactly what happened to me, because after that night, nothing changed all at once, it changed quietly. In small ways that no one else would question, but every one of those changes pulled me a little further away from the life I used to have, and a little closer to something I didn't understand. Because suddenly I wasn't just Celestine anymore, I was chosen, I was special, I was blessed, and everyone around me started treating me like I was something sacred, something delicate, something set apart. And maybe that sounds beautiful, until you realize that being set apart also means being separated, being isolated, being removed from everything that once felt normal, and that's exactly what happened. Because my parents stopped speaking to me the way they used to, my mother would look at me with this strange mix of pride and reverence, like I wasn't just her daughter anymore, but something higher, something she didn't quite belong to. And my father, he became quieter, more distant, like he didn't know how to talk to me anymore, like I had been placed on a level he couldn't reach. And at first, I didn't question it, because how could I? When everything around me was telling me this was right, when every smile, every word, every glance reinforced the idea that this was something good, something holy, something I should accept without hesitation. And that's the thing about belief. When it surrounds you completely, it becomes stronger than your own instincts, stronger than that small voice inside you that tries to say something isn't right. And I felt that voice, I really did. But it was quiet and it was easy to ignore, especially when the man at the center of all of this spoke with such certainty, such calm authority, because Pastor Caldwell didn't rush anything, he didn't demand, he didn't force, he guided slowly, carefully, in a way that made everything feel intentional, like every step was part of something bigger, something meaningful, and he began calling me to the church more often, not for sermons, not for public moments, but for private conversations, for what he called spiritual guidance. And that phrase, it sounded harmless, even comforting, because guidance implies care, it implies protection, it implies someone looking out for you. And maybe that's why I went. Maybe that's why I sat across from him in that quiet office with the stained glass window casting colored light across the room. Maybe that's why I listened, even when something inside me felt unsettled. Because he spoke in a way that made everything sound right. He never raised his voice, never showed anger. He was patient, calm, almost gentle. And that's what made it so confusing, because you expect something wrong to feel harsh, to feel obvious, but this didn't. This felt soft, controlled, wrapped in words that made it hard to see clearly. And he would take my hand sometimes while he spoke, not tightly, not forcefully, just enough to make it feel intentional. Like it meant something, and he would read passages from the Bible, but not the ones I was used to hearing, not the ones about kindness or forgiveness. He chose the ones about obedience, about purpose, about sacrifice. And then he would explain them in a way that connected directly to me, to my role, to what he said I had been chosen for. And slowly, without even realizing it, I started to feel something change inside me. Not belief exactly, but confusion, because when someone speaks with enough confidence, enough certainty, it makes you question your own thoughts. It makes you wonder if maybe you're the one who doesn't understand. Maybe you're the one who needs to learn, and that's how it happens, not all at once, but piece by piece, until the lines between right and wrong start to blur. And I remember one moment so clearly, sitting there in that office. The light from the window falling across his face, his voice steady as ever, and he said something that stayed with me. He said that sometimes God chooses people for roles others can't understand. That true purpose often feels uncomfortable at first. That doubt is just a sign of weak faith, and hearing that, it did something to me because suddenly my fear wasn't a warning anymore. It was a flaw, something I needed to fix, something I needed to overcome. And that's the most dangerous shift of all, when you stop trusting your instincts and start correcting them instead. And from that moment on, I tried to be what they said I was supposed to be. I tried to be quiet, obedient, accepting. I tried to ignore the way my chest tightened every time I was called to those meetings. I tried to silence that small voice inside me that kept asking questions I didn't dare say out loud. Because questioning felt wrong, questioning felt like I was failing something bigger than myself, and everyone around me reinforced that, the church, the people, even my own family, because in their eyes, I wasn't losing anything, I was gaining something sacred, something meaningful, something to be proud of, and that's what made it so isolating, because when everyone around you sees something as good, you don't just feel alone, you feel wrong. Like your fear doesn't belong, like your discomfort is something you have to hide. And I hid it well. I learned to nod, to listen, to accept without showing what I really felt. And over time, that became easier. Not because things got better, but because I stopped resisting. And that's when it truly takes hold, not when you're forced into it, but when you start adapting to it, when you start adjusting yourself to fit something you don't understand. And looking back now, I can see exactly when that shift happened, the moment I stopped asking why and started asking how to be what they expected, how to fit into the role I had been given, how to make sense of something that never truly made sense at all. And maybe you've experienced something like that in your own way. That slow shift where something feels wrong, but you convince yourself it must be right because everyone else says it is. Because that's how it begins, quietly, subtly, without a clear line between before and after. Just a gradual movement into something you don't recognize until it's already part of you. And that's exactly where I found myself, not trapped in the way you might imagine, not locked away or held down, but guided, shaped, influenced in a way that felt almost invisible. And that's what made it so powerful, because I didn't feel like I was losing control. I felt like I was giving it away willingly, and that's a very different kind of prison. One where the door is open, but you don't realize you're not free. And just when I thought I understood what was happening, just when I thought I had adjusted enough to survive it, something happened that made everything impossible to ignore. Something that changed the situation from confusing to undeniable, and the moment it happened, I knew there was no going back, because this wasn't just about belief anymore, it was about reality. And reality has a way of forcing you to see things you've been trying to avoid. What if I told you the most dangerous moment isn't when something feels wrong, it's when you finally stop fighting it? Because that's exactly where I found myself, somewhere between fear and acceptance. Somewhere between knowing something wasn't right and convincing myself it had to be. And once you reach that place, everything changes because you stop resisting and start adapting. And adapting is quiet, it doesn't feel like surrender. It feels like survival, like you're just doing what you need to do to make sense of what's happening. And that's how I began to live my life, not questioning, not pushing back, just moving forward one day at a time. Telling myself that this must be what I was meant for, because that's what everyone else believed. And when everyone around you believes something so completely, it becomes harder and harder to hold on to your own doubt. And maybe you felt that too, that slow shift where your thoughts don't feel like your own anymore, where your instincts get replaced by what you've been told to believe. And that's exactly how it happened. Because the more time I spent under his guidance, the more my world began to shrink, not physically, but emotionally, mentally, until everything outside of that role I had been given started to feel distant, less important, almost irrelevant. And I remember noticing it in small ways at first, the way I stopped thinking about my future the way I used to, the way I stopped imagining a life beyond what was already being decided for me. The way my days became predictable, structured around what he said I needed, what he said I was meant to become, and that predictability, it made everything feel easier in a strange way, because when your path is decided for you, you don't have to question it, you don't have to wonder what comes next, you just follow, and following feels safe even when it isn't, and that's the illusion, the sense of safety that keeps you from seeing what's really happening. because nothing about it felt dramatic. Nothing about it felt like something you could point to and say, this is wrong. It was just a series of small steps that led me further and further away from who I used to be, and closer to someone I didn't recognize. And then there was the ceremony, and even calling it that feels strange because it wasn't what you might imagine. There was no celebration, no joy, no music, just a quiet room in the church. A few people standing around with solemn expressions, my parents included, their faces filled with pride and belief, and him, standing at the front, speaking words that sounded sacred but felt heavy, confusing, final. And I stood there in a simple dress, my hands trembling slightly, my mind trying to keep up with everything that was happening, trying to understand what this meant, what I was becoming, but there was no space for questions. No pause for reflection, just a steady progression from one moment to the next until suddenly, it was done. And just like that, something had been sealed, something had been decided, something that couldn't be undone. And I remember the way the room felt afterward, the silence, the weight of it, the way everyone looked at me like I had stepped into something sacred, something beyond them, and maybe from the outside it looked that way. Maybe it looked like I had been given something special, but inside, I felt empty, like something had been taken without anyone realizing it, like I had crossed a line I didn't even see clearly, and that emptiness, it stayed with me. It followed me into the days that came after, into the new life I was now part of, living in a place that wasn't my home but was expected to feel like it. Surrounded by people who believed in what was happening so strongly that it made it feel impossible to question. And that's when the isolation truly began, not the kind where you're physically alone, but the kind where you're surrounded by people and still feel completely disconnected, because no one saw what I felt, no one questioned what was happening, no one even considered that there might be something wrong. And that kind of isolation, it changes you, it makes you quieter, more careful, more aware of what you say and what you keep to yourself. And I learned quickly that silence was easier. That keeping everything inside was safer than trying to explain something no one else was willing to see. And so I adapted, I played the role I had been given. I became what they expected, at least on the surface. Because inside, something was still there, something small but persistent, something that hadn't completely disappeared, and that something, it showed itself in moments I couldn't ignore, moments where everything felt too real, too undeniable to push away, like the nights when I lay awake staring at the ceiling, my thoughts louder than ever, asking questions I didn't have answers for. Or the moments when I caught my reflection and didn't recognize the person looking back at me. And those moments, they built slowly, quietly, until they reached a point where I couldn't ignore them anymore. And that's when everything shifted again, not gradually this time, but suddenly, in a way that forced me to see what I had been trying not to see, because sometimes reality doesn't give you a choice. Sometimes it puts something right in front of you that you can't explain away, can't justify, can't ignore. And for me, that moment came in the form of something I wasn't ready for, something that changed everything instantly. Something that took all the confusion, all the doubt, all the quiet fear, and turned it into something undeniable. Because one day, without warning, without preparation, I realized something that made my entire world stop. Something that made it impossible to pretend anymore. Something that made it clear that this wasn't just about belief or faith or purpose. This was something real, something physical, something that would change my life in a way I could never undo. And the moment I understood it, the moment it became clear, I felt something I hadn't felt before, not confusion, not doubt, but pure, overwhelming certainty that whatever this was, whatever they called it, whatever they believed it to be, it wasn't right. And if you think that realization came with clarity or strength, it didn't, because knowing the truth doesn't always make you stronger. Sometimes it just makes you more afraid. Because once you see something clearly, you can't unsee it, and from that moment on, everything I had been trying to accept became impossible to ignore, because this wasn't just happening around me anymore, it was happening to me. And there was no way to pretend otherwise. What if I told you the moment you realize something is truly wrong isn't loud or dramatic, it's quiet, heavy, and impossible to escape? Because once it settles inside you, it changes the way you see everything, and for me, that moment came when I understood something I could no longer explain away, no matter how hard I tried, because all the confusion, all the doubt, all the things I had been pushing down suddenly came together into one undeniable truth. I was pregnant, and the second that realization took hold, everything inside me froze, not because I didn't understand what it meant, but because I understood it too well. And maybe you can imagine that feeling, that instant where your entire world shifts and nothing looks the same anymore, where every belief you were holding onto suddenly cracks under the weight of reality. Because this wasn't something I could twist into meaning, this wasn't something I could convince myself was just part of a higher purpose. This was real, this was happening to me. And for the first time since all of this began, I couldn't hide from it, and the fear that came with that realization wasn't quiet anymore. It wasn't something I could push aside or explain away. It was overwhelming, suffocating. The kind that settles deep in your chest and makes it hard to breathe, because suddenly everything felt exposed, like a secret that had been hidden was now impossible to contain. And I remember sitting there trying to process it, trying to understand what this meant for me, for my life, for everything that had been happening, and for a brief moment, I thought this would change everything. I thought this would be the moment where the truth became too obvious to ignore. The moment where people would finally see what I had been feeling all along. The moment where everything would stop, and maybe that sounds naive. But when you're holding on to even the smallest hope that something will break the illusion, you cling to it, because it's the only thing that makes the situation feel survivable. And so I told him, my voice barely steady, my hands trembling in a way I couldn't control, because this wasn't something I could hide, this wasn't something I could keep inside, and I expected anger, denial, something that would reflect the seriousness of what I was saying. But what I got instead was something far worse, because he didn't get angry, he didn't seem surprised, he didn't even hesitate, he smiled slowly, calmly, like this was exactly what he had been expecting. Like this was something he had been waiting for, and in that moment, something inside me dropped in a way I can't fully describe. Because when someone reacts to something like that with calm acceptance, it tells you everything you need to know without them saying a word. And then he spoke, his voice soft but certain, and he called it a miracle. He said it was a sign, a blessing. Proof that what we were doing was part of something divine. And hearing that, it didn't comfort me, it terrified me, because suddenly this wasn't just something that had happened. It was something he had already decided the meaning of. Something he had already turned into part of the story he was telling everyone. And I realized then that this wasn't going to expose anything. This wasn't going to break the illusion, it was going to strengthen it. And that realization, it was crushing, because the one thing I thought might change everything had just been turned into something that would trap me even further, and I didn't fully understand how far that would go until that Sunday. Until I walked into the church and felt something different in the air, something heavier, something expectant. And as I sat there, trying to steady myself, trying to make sense of everything, he stepped up to the front like he always did. His presence filling the room, his voice carrying across every corner, and he began to speak, not about me directly at first, but about faith, about miracles, about how God works in ways people don't always understand. And as he spoke, I felt something building, something I couldn't stop, something I couldn't escape, because I knew where this was going before he even said it. And when he finally did, when he turned his attention toward me, when he spoke about a blessing, about a child, about something sacred being brought into the world, I felt every eye in that room shift toward me, every glance, every whisper, every breath, and in that moment there was no hiding anymore. No pretending, no escape, because I wasn't just a girl sitting in a church, I had become something else entirely, something public, something everyone could see, something that belonged to the story he had created. And what happened next is something I will never forget, because instead of shock, instead of doubt, instead of even a single question, there was celebration. People stood, people smiled, people cried. They called it a blessing. They called it a miracle. They looked at me with admiration, with awe, with something that felt so completely disconnected from what I was feeling inside that it made everything even more surreal. Because while they were celebrating, I was breaking, and that contrast, that complete separation between what was happening outside and what I was feeling inside, it's something that stays with you because it shows you just how powerful belief can be. How it can turn something terrifying into something beautiful in the eyes of others. How it can completely erase the reality of what's actually happening. And in that moment, I understood something I hadn't fully accepted before. Something that settled deep inside me with a kind of clarity I couldn't ignore. I was completely alone, not because there weren't people around me, but because none of them could see what I saw, none of them felt what I felt. None of them questioned what I questioned, and that kind of isolation, it's deeper than anything else because it doesn't just separate you from others, it separates you from your own ability to speak, to express, to even acknowledge what's happening. And as I sat there, surrounded by voices praising something I couldn't understand, I felt something shift inside me again. But this time it wasn't confusion, it wasn't doubt, it was awareness. A quiet but undeniable realization that this wasn't going to stop, this wasn't going to change, this was going to continue exactly the way it had been, no matter what I felt, no matter what I believed. And that's when another thought began to form, slowly, quietly, but strong enough that I couldn't ignore it. If this was happening to me, then it had to have happened before, because something like this doesn't just begin out of nowhere. Something like this has a pattern, a history, something hidden beneath the surface that no one talks about, and the more I thought about it, the more that idea grew until it became impossible to ignore. Because suddenly everything started to feel less like a one-time event and more like something that had been happening long before me, and standing there in the middle of all that celebration, surrounded by people who believed they were witnessing something sacred, I couldn't stop one question from echoing in my mind louder than anything else. What if I wasn't the first? What if I told you the most terrifying truth isn't what's happening to you, it's realizing it's happened before? Because the moment that thought took hold in my mind, what if I wasn't the first, everything around me started to look different. The same faces, the same church, the same quiet routines. But now there was something underneath it all. Something hidden, something I hadn't been able to see before. And once that kind of doubt enters your mind, it doesn't leave, it grows. It spreads into every memory, every moment, until even the smallest detail starts to feel like a clue. And maybe you felt that too, that shift where something you once accepted suddenly feels suspicious, where things you ignored before now seem important. And that's exactly what happened to me, because I began to notice things I hadn't paid attention to before, the way certain conversations would stop when I entered a room. The way some of the older women in the church looked at me, not with admiration, but with something closer to pity, something unspoken, something they never dared to say out loud, and those looks, they stayed with me. Because they didn't match the story everyone else was telling, they didn't match the idea that this was something holy, something blessed, something to celebrate. And that contradiction, it made it impossible to ignore the question that had already begun to take shape in my mind, and I didn't know where to look for answers. I didn't know who I could trust. Because trust had been the very thing that led me here in the first place. But sometimes the truth doesn't come from where you expect it. Sometimes it comes from the quietest place, the person no one pays attention to. The one who sees everything because they're invisible to everyone else. And for me, that person was Dorothy May, the old cleaning woman at the church, the one who moved through the building like a shadow, always there but never noticed. The one people spoke around but never really to, and maybe that's why she saw what others didn't. Maybe that's why she understood things no one else questioned. Because one afternoon, in the quiet basement of the church, surrounded by the smell of damp walls and old cloth, she looked at me in a way no one else ever had, not with awe, not with pride, not with pity, but with recognition. Like she knew something about me that I hadn't even fully admitted to myself yet. And when she spoke, her voice was low, careful, almost hesitant, like she was stepping into something dangerous just by saying the words out loud. And she asked me a question that made my entire body tense. She asked if he had told me I was special, if he had said I was chosen, and hearing that, it felt like the ground shifted beneath me. Because those were the exact words he had used, the exact things everyone had repeated, and suddenly those words didn't feel unique anymore. They felt rehearsed, repeated, like something that had been said before. And I didn't even have time to respond before she leaned closer, her eyes sharper now, her voice quieter but more urgent. And she told me something that changed everything. She told me there had been others, girls just like me. Girls who had been told the same things, who had been chosen, who had been blessed. And for a moment, I couldn't process it, because hearing something like that doesn't just add to your understanding, it shatters it completely. Because everything I had been told, everything I had been trying to make sense of, suddenly collapsed under the weight of that truth. And she didn't stop there. She told me about them, not in detail, not in long explanations, but in fragments. In pieces that were somehow even more disturbing because of what they didn't say. She told me about one girl whose family left town suddenly, without explanation, about another who was sent away somewhere far, about stories that ended without answers, without closure. And then she told me about one who didn't leave at all, one who didn't get the chance, a girl who died young during childbirth. And hearing that, something inside me broke in a way I can't fully describe, because up until that moment, everything had been confusing, uncertain, something I could still try to explain away, but now there was no explanation left. No way to twist it into something acceptable, no way to pretend this was anything other than what it truly was, and the realization hit me all at once, heavy and undeniable. I wasn't chosen, I wasn't special, I was part of a pattern. Part of something that had been happening long before I ever realized it. And that kind of realization, it doesn't just scare you, it changes you. It forces you to see everything differently, to question everything you once believed. And as I stood there in that quiet basement, listening to a truth no one else dared to speak, I felt something shift inside me again. But this time it wasn't confusion, it wasn't doubt, it was clarity. Cold and sharp and impossible to ignore, because now I understood exactly what this was, exactly what had been happening, and more importantly, exactly what it meant for me. Because if there had been others before me, then there would be others after me, and that thought, it stayed with me. It followed me back to that house, into every room, into every moment. Because suddenly I wasn't just living my own story anymore. I was part of something much bigger, something darker, something that had been hidden in plain sight for years, and once you see something like that, you can't unsee it. You can't go back to believing what you believed before. You can't return to that place of uncertainty, because now the truth is clear, and clarity, it changes everything. And as that truth settled deeper inside me, as I began to understand just how far this went, just how carefully it had been hidden, I realized something else, something that made everything even more dangerous than I had imagined. Because if this had been happening for so long, then there had to be a reason no one had stopped it. There had to be something keeping it hidden, something protecting it, something making sure the truth never fully came out. And that thought, it led me to a question I couldn't ignore, a question that felt heavier than anything before it. What if the proof was still there, hidden somewhere, waiting to be found? What if I told you the truth was never really hidden? It was just locked away somewhere no one dared to look, because once that question settled in my mind, what if the proof was still there, it didn't leave. It followed me into every moment, every room, every quiet second where my thoughts had space to breathe. And the more I thought about it, the clearer it became. Something like this doesn't survive for years without structure, without a system, without something keeping it organized and controlled. And that realization changed the way I saw everything. Because now I wasn't just a girl trapped in something I didn't understand. I was someone standing on the edge of a truth that could explain everything. And maybe you felt that too, that shift where fear turns into something else, something sharper. Something more focused, where instead of just wanting to escape, you want to understand. And that's exactly where I was, caught between terror and clarity, because I knew that whatever I was looking for, it was dangerous. But not knowing felt even worse, and the opportunity came in a way I didn't expect, not dramatic, not planned, just a small moment that most people would have ignored because one day, for the first time since I had been brought into that house, I was alone, truly alone, the kind of silence that feels unfamiliar when you're used to being watched, and even that felt strange, like something wasn't right. Like the absence of his presence was just as unsettling as when he was there, and I remember standing in the middle of that quiet house, my heart beating faster than it should have, not because anything was happening, but because something might. And that's when the thought returned, stronger than before, this is your chance. And I didn't fully decide to act, not consciously, not in a clear, deliberate way, but my body moved before my mind could stop it. My feet carrying me toward the one place I had always avoided, the one place that felt like the center of everything, his office. And even standing outside that door, I hesitated. Because there's a difference between suspecting something and proving it. And once you prove it, there's no going back, no pretending, no denying what you know, and part of me wanted to turn away. To stay in that space of uncertainty where things were still unclear, because uncertainty, as painful as it is, can sometimes feel safer than the truth, but something stronger pushed me forward. Something that had been building since the moment I realized I wasn't the first. And slowly, carefully, I stepped inside, and the room felt exactly the same as it always had, neat, quiet. Filled with books and papers and that faint smell of polish and age. Nothing out of place, nothing obvious, nothing that would make anyone question what kind of man worked there. And that's what made it so unsettling, because everything looked normal. Everything looked exactly the way it should, and yet I knew something wasn't right, something was hidden beneath that surface. And I began to move slowly, carefully, touching nothing at first, just observing, letting my eyes take in every detail. Every corner, every object, searching for something that didn't belong, something that stood out, and at first there was nothing, just ordinary things arranged in an orderly way. And for a moment, doubt crept back in, making me question myself. Making me wonder if maybe I had imagined it, if maybe there was nothing to find after all. But then, I saw it, not something obvious, not something dramatic, just a small detail that felt different. A drawer that didn't open as easily as the others, a lock where there didn't need to be one, and that's the thing about truth. It often hides in the smallest details, the things most people would overlook, and as I stood there, staring at that locked drawer, I felt something shift inside me again, because now this wasn't just suspicion. This was confirmation that something was being kept hidden, and my hands trembled as I looked around the room, searching for a key. Not even sure if I would use it if I found it, because once you open something like that, you can't close it again, at least not in your mind. And then I saw it, resting quietly among other small objects. Something that looked ordinary enough to belong there, something no one would think twice about, and I picked it up slowly, my heart pounding louder with every second, because this was the moment. The point where everything would either remain uncertain or become undeniable. And when I placed that key into the lock, when I felt it turn, when I heard that small, quiet click, it sounded louder than anything I had ever heard before. Because in that instant, something changed, something irreversible. And as I pulled the drawer open, I didn't find chaos. I didn't find anything messy or scattered. I found something far worse, something organized, deliberate. Something that spoke of planning, of intention, of a system that had been carefully built over time. Because inside that drawer was a book, simple, unremarkable at first glance. But the moment I opened it, everything became clear, because there, written in careful, deliberate handwriting, were names, dates, notes, not random, not meaningless, but structured, recorded, tracked. And as my eyes moved across those pages, as I recognized what I was looking at, as I saw the patterns, the repetitions, the same story unfolding again and again with different names, different girls, I felt something inside me collapse completely, because this wasn't just proof. This was confirmation of everything I had feared. Everything I had begun to understand, everything that had been hidden behind words like faith and purpose. And suddenly those words meant nothing, because what I was looking at wasn't sacred, it was calculated. And I wasn't chosen, I was listed, just another name in a system that had been running long before I ever stepped into it. And that realization, it changes something deep inside you, because once you see yourself not as special, not as unique, but as part of something planned, something controlled, it removes every illusion, every layer of belief that had been built around you. And I remember standing there, the book still open in my hands, my thoughts racing, my heart pounding, because now I knew not just what had happened, but how it had happened, how it had been allowed to continue, how it had been repeated without anyone stopping it, and that knowledge, it didn't bring relief. It didn't bring comfort, it brought something else entirely, urgency, because now this wasn't just about understanding anymore, this was about what came next. Because once you hold the truth in your hands, you have to decide what to do with it. And that decision, it's not easy, because truth has consequences, especially when it threatens something that powerful, something that protected, something that had been hidden for so long. And as I carefully placed that book back where I found it, as I locked that drawer again, as I stepped back into the silence of that room, I realized something that made everything even more real than before. I wasn't just living inside this anymore. I was now carrying something that could destroy it. And that realization, it didn't make me feel safe. It made me feel like I was standing at the edge of something dangerous, something that could change everything in an instant, because the moment you know the truth, you become part of it. And once that happens, there's no way to go back to who you were before, and standing there, knowing what I knew, holding that secret inside me, I couldn't ignore one final thought that rose above everything else. If this truth could destroy him, then what would it do to me? What if I told you the moment you decide to escape isn't when you feel ready? It's when staying becomes more dangerous than leaving, because after everything I had seen, after holding that truth in my hands and realizing I was just one name in a long, hidden list, something inside me changed in a way that couldn't be undone, because fear doesn't disappear when you understand it, it transforms. It sharpens, it turns into something that pushes you forward instead of holding you back. And that's exactly what happened to me, because for the first time since all of this began, I wasn't just afraid of him. I was afraid of what would happen if I stayed, afraid of becoming another story that ended without answers, another name that disappeared into silence, and maybe you felt that too. That moment where fear stops being something you run from and becomes something that forces you to act, because the thought of doing nothing becomes unbearable, and that's where I found myself, standing between two choices that both felt impossible. Because leaving meant stepping into a world I didn't understand, a world where I had no protection, no plan, no certainty of what would happen next, but staying meant something far worse, something I now understood clearly. Something I could no longer pretend was anything other than what it truly was. And once that clarity settles in, there's no real choice left, even if it feels like there is. And I didn't make that decision all at once. Not in a dramatic moment, not with some sudden burst of courage. It came quietly, built from every realization, every moment of truth, every piece of understanding that had been forming inside me. Until one night, it became unavoidable, because I knew if I didn't leave then, I might never leave at all, and that thought alone was enough to push me forward, even though every part of me was terrified. And I remember that night so clearly, the house quiet, the kind of silence that feels heavier than usual, like it's waiting for something, and my heart was beating so loud I was sure it would give me away. Because even the smallest sound felt dangerous, every step felt like it might be the one that changed everything. And maybe you can imagine that feeling, that tension where every second matters, where every movement feels like a risk. And yet you keep going because stopping isn't an option anymore. And I moved carefully, slowly, gathering what little I could without making noise, knowing I couldn't take much, knowing I couldn't plan everything. Because sometimes survival doesn't give you the luxury of preparation. It only gives you a moment, and you either take it or you lose it. And that's exactly what this was, a moment I couldn't afford to miss. And as I stood there, at the edge of everything I had known, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, not confidence, not certainty, but determination, a quiet, steady understanding that whatever happened next, it had to be better than what I was leaving behind, and that belief, as small as it was enough to carry me forward. And when I finally reached that door, when my hand touched the handle, I hesitated just for a second, because there's something powerful about that final moment, the one where everything you've known is behind you and everything unknown is in front of you. And it forces you to confront something deeper than fear. It forces you to confront yourself, to ask whether you're truly ready to step into something uncertain, something unpredictable, something that could change everything in ways you can't control. And in that moment, I didn't have answers. I didn't know what would happen. I didn't know where I would go or how I would survive. But I knew one thing clearly: I couldn't stay, and that was enough. And so I opened that door. And the air outside felt different, colder, sharper, real in a way I hadn't felt in years. And for a brief moment, I just stood there, feeling it, realizing that this was the first step into something completely unknown. Something that could either break me or finally set me free, and I chose to step forward, even though every instinct was screaming at me to turn back, even though every fear was still there. Because sometimes courage isn't the absence of fear, it's moving forward despite it. And as I walked away from that house, from everything that had defined my life for so long, I felt something shift inside me again. But this time, it wasn't fear, it wasn't confusion, it wasn't doubt, it was something else. Something I hadn't felt in a long time, possibility. And that feeling, it's powerful because it reminds you that your story isn't over. That no matter how trapped you've been, no matter how long you've lived in something you couldn't escape, there is still something beyond it, still something waiting on the other side of that door, and I didn't know what that would look like. I didn't know how hard it would be. I didn't know how long it would take to rebuild everything I had lost. But I knew one thing for certain: I had taken back something that had been taken from me a long time ago. Something I didn't even realize I had lost until that moment, my life, and that realization, it changes everything. Because once you understand that your life belongs to you again, you stop living for what others expect. You stop accepting what doesn't feel right. You stop allowing yourself to be part of something that was never meant for you. And that's where my story truly began, not in that house, not in that church, not in the life I was forced into, but in the moment I chose to leave it behind. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do isn't to fight what's happening, it's to walk away from it entirely. And if there's one thing I've learned after everything I've lived through, it's this: they may try to control your story, they may try to define your life. They may even convince you that what's happening is meant to be, but the moment you choose to step away, the moment you choose to take your life back, everything changes, and maybe that's the question this leaves you with. The one I didn't ask myself until it was almost too late: if you realized your life was never truly yours, would you have the courage to take it back?